As a bankruptcy attorney, I know that getting that discharge and fresh start in your financial life can be liberating. No longer having the stress of carrying debt is great, but the next question is, where do you go from there? To answer that question, I talked to fellow bankruptcy attorney Barry Levine about the steps you can take to rebuild your financial life.
My guest today is Barry Levine, a bankruptcy attorney in Boston, Massachusetts, where he, like me, helps people to get a fresh financial start through bankruptcy. Barry's not your typical lawyer, though. He describes himself as an old hippie who happens to practice law. And his YouTube content shows a personality that's equal parts candid, irreverent, and deeply ethical. That
Thank you.
authenticity helps break down barriers for listeners who may feel shame, confusion, or fear around financial collapse and having to file bankruptcy. Welcome to the show, Barry.
Hey, good morning. I almost had to see who you were talking about for a second there. I wasn't quite sure.
Well, hopefully we nailed who you are. Uh,
Well,
but yeah, we were chatting before I hit record about, you practice bankruptcy in the Boston area, Massachusetts, and I practice it down here in New Jersey. And I said, what I tell people is bankruptcy is one language with 50 dialects, in that bankruptcy is can be very different from state to state depending upon because there's a lot of interaction with state law. So it's kind of hard to talk about bankruptcy in the context of the mechanism itself and how it gives you a fresh start because the law can change and be very different depending upon where you are. But we're not here to talk about that. We all know bankruptcy can be a lifesaver for people buried in debt. But then the question is, once they get their discharge, what comes next? You know, what can they do to make sure that that fresh start lasts? And that's what we want to talk about today.
sure.
For any listeners out there, or if you're listening and know of someone that is going through bankruptcy or contemplating it, uh, it's not uh, it's not the end of the world, and usually the best thing for you. And I tell clients, it's not like breaking a mirror. You don't have 10 years bad credit because that bankruptcy is on your credit report. So let's talk about how to rebuild it. Uh,
Sure.
what can people do? They've as they go through the bankruptcy process and start looking forward to life after discharge. What can they start doing to rebuild things so that they can benefit the most from their fresh start?
Well, what I tell clients, and this is in the category of very much easier said than done nowadays, is to try to develop a relationship with a small bank, like a credit union, a little town bank. Most of these, they don't exist anymore, but a bank where a banker could look at the client more as an individual than a FICO score. Decades ago when, well, you have more hair than I do, but when I had a lot more hair, there were games players, they knew what they would play the bankruptcy. Now most people are straight up people. They lose a job. I mean, they're making $250,000 a year and suddenly they become a contract worker. But at $250,000 a year, they were keeping all the balls in the air. So it's not people who, people who are up against it. And I find that if they can find that bank, or I encourage them. I mean, you probably know about collateralized credit cards. I suggest that as a route. Listen, if you must see young debtors nowadays, in their 20s and 30s with kids, they probably want to go to Disney. So you need a credit card. You're not going to bring 2 rand in 20s to rent a car. So, a collateralized credit card. We have some banks here that, you put money into a CD, they give you a line of credit or a credit card. And, bottom line is you make the payments. Life is grand. The other thing is a lot of people, and I have to preface it by saying they have to reaffirm the consumer debt in their bankruptcies. They If they have a mortgage or they have a car loan, that going forward will stand in their favor, assuming they continue to make the payments.
Hmm.
The interesting thing about that, and I tell lots of stories, is I had a client who lost his business in the computer blow up before the bank blow up in the late aughts. And he wasn't working. He had a house there was no equity in it at all. I don't know how he paid the mortgage. He couldn't reaffirm the debt. The court wouldn't allow it.
Hmm.
10 years later, he comes to me. He wants to refinance because the mortgage rates have reduced. He goes to the bank he's been paying for 10 years. The bank tells him they can't do anything for them because he discharged the debt in bankruptcy. He didn't reaffirm it. And on his credit report, that's what it shows.
Well,
Which is
reaffirmation can help, and I think that opinions can vary on this. For example, here in New Jersey, uh, basically we don't reaffirm mortgages. We
I,
don't see it as an upside. Now, under the bankruptcy code, for listeners out there, if you have a car loan and things like that, you are, unless you want to give up the car or pay off the balance of the car loan, the bank can require you to reaffirm it. And just so everybody's clear on our terminology, reaffirm means you put the loan in the bankruptcy, and reaffirming it takes it out, so it doesn't get
survives your
discharged.
discharge.
So and if it isn't discharged, then payments on that loan continue to be reported to your credit and can help you rebuild afterwards. But
That's why I keep Kafka on my desk because
yeah.
it made no sense to me that here's a guy going to his bank 10 years worth of payments.
Mhm.
And they go, what?
Well,
Very weird.
also that's 10. What else was he doing in the past 10 years? I tell people, and we're talking about 10 years, folks, the listeners out there, that
It's a
bankruptcy
long
sat on your
time.
credit for 10 years. But I tell people, it's not a credit report, it's a credit history. And at some point, that credit history becomes credit ancient history. And lenders are more interested in what you did post bankruptcy than the fact that you filed. So this person that you describe, I suspect, wasn't really proactive in rebuilding
You
his credit after the bankruptcy, and that was more the problem that he had 10 years later.
He just
uh,
figured he's making the payments.
right, even though he was making the payments, they weren't being reported,
Exactly.
because you can't do that under the Fair Credit Reporting Act because it's a discharged debt. So, and so that's that. Now, we talked a little bit about collateralized credit cards. I've called them secured credit cards, and you kind of talked about that. But just to clarify to the listeners, that this is basically, you give them a security deposit, and the bank holds it, and that security deposit, your credit limit on the card, is essentially either a fraction or multiple of that security deposit. And if you use the card and pay the bill every month, and you're a good boy or girl for usually about 12 months, they will convert it to a regular credit card. So that helps you get back in your feet. And it's important to bear in mind, as I'm sure you know, Barry, not all banks are reporting banks when you get these cards. So
No,
you go through 12 months of being a good boy or girl and paying the bill every month, and none of that goes on your credit. So it may convert to a credit card, and then you have a credit card, but that credit history starts at that point, not the 12 months you spent paying the bill. Like that guy spent 10 years paying his mortgage and he didn't get any credit for it. So that's important, right? So, all right. So we've talked about, oh, and you talked about working with a bank. I did an episode not long ago on the benefits of being part of a credit union. Have you ever had people maybe have some more success in
I,
post bankruptcy by using a credit union as opposed to a traditional
I,
bank?
I happen to agree with you. Credit unions are a better avenue to a post-discharge to pursue if you're going to look to get a bank that's going to react to you personally. They seem to have a little more flexibility. It's tough when you go to a big institutionalized bank, they don't have any leeway, your credit score. But I happen to agree with you. That's a great way. And very often, they seem to be post-discharge a little more flexible with giving loans out. And if you open up an account, they'll give you a half a percentage point discount or something like that.
Mhm.
So listen, banks, I guess, are a necessary evil, but some of them benefit you and some of them don't.
And yeah, and as you said, it's very difficult these days to get through life without financially without a credit card or some sort of electronic payment method. I mean, you could use a debit card or services like Venmo to transfer
And,
money or pay for
and
things. But
and I have to tell you something. I have a case now where I learned that they call it money transfer something or others. There are hundreds of them.
Mhm,
The younger generation, we know from Venmo and PayPal, there's Cash App, there's Moon, there's Luna. You can't keep track of it.
mhm.
It's you know, it's a very weird world out there, especially for us old timers.
But the problem with that though is if you use these apps and Venmo and things like that or a debit card, all you're doing is moving cash around, and it does nothing to rebuild your credit post
You're right.
bankruptcy to get back on your feet. And doing that and having the secure credit card that then converts into a regular credit card can help. But also, I'd like to talk to you about good stewardship with credit cards. People get in deep with credit cards. Some of them say, "I'm never going to use a credit card again." Credit cards in and of themselves are not evil and can help you rebuild credit afterwards. But I think things like uh, uh, just paying off the balance every month instead of carrying a balance. And could you talk a little bit about, it's not just your credit history or your credit report, but the FICO score that's based on it.
Absolutely.
Now, the no, we don't know what the secret formula is that FICO has to come up with that number, but we do know how what the different um, parts of the recipe are and what the portions are and what they make up. So could you talk about there's the two biggest are what's called utilization and payment history. Can you talk a little bit about that and how
Well,
people can use that to rebuild?
to me, most debtors, when you ask them if they're current with their payments, well, the payment's due in October. I usually pay the end of October.
Uh-huh.
It's not easy to get across to them that they have to try to be more timely,
Mhm.
especially from a credit reporting point of view.
Mhm.
From my own perspective, I'm too old. I don't care anymore. I really don't. But if you're looking to build your credit, and nowadays you have a lot of youngsters. I mean, decades ago, somebody would come to me with $22,000 worth of debt, and they were in their early 20s. I'd say maybe think of something else. But now if they play their cards right going forward, they'll find that nothing really changes.
Mhm.
They will get, granted, it's not as easy as things were, let's say, before the banks imploded in 2008 or 2009,
Mhm.
when I remember driving around and saying to my mother, "You see that $5 million house in Marblehead? I could buy that.
Mhm.
They won't look to see if I had any income. I maybe make the first payment." That those days are gone. You have to work at it.
Right.
But if people go about doing things like, if the payment is due on a certain date, they make that payment, things along those lines, it makes life easy for them because nowadays, dealing with the credit card companies, it used to be they're like Jewish mothers. Everybody gives them their cell phone addresses and their email addresses. And if the payment is due on the first, at 12:01 on the second, they phone you and send you an email that the payment wasn't made.
Right.
Or they remind you in advance that the payment is due.
Mhm.
And for myself, having had a Jewish mother,
Hmm.
the instinct to do just the opposite from nudging me like that. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Again, if you're looking to get yourself going correctly, you have to play it straight. You can't just play games with everything. If you're looking
Mhm.
to build something, if your mortgage payment is due on the first and you have a 4-day grace period, try to make it within the grace period. You know, I had a client who he had a second mortgage, and every month he paid it on, he was in a chapter 13. He paid it on the 20th. It was
Hmm.
due on the first.
Hmm.
The lender would call me up and I would say, "Why are you nudging me? What do you want from me? You know, he pays it every month on the 20th."
Hmm.
I finally got it across to them, and finally they sent me an authorization that said they could talk to the debtor directly. I haven't heard from them since.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
But
it's not only making the payment every month, but you have to make it by the deadline, or
exactly.
because
From
that
the bank's point of view, you're making the payment, but it was due on the second or the first, whatever date it is.
and that timeliness of that not only making a payment, making it on time, that's 35% of your FICO score. They it goes back, I believe, 24 months on every month. Was it on time? Was it behind? Did you miss a payment? So it's not just making a payment every month, it's making a payment on time every month.
Well, and most people, I don't know, in New Jersey, can a consumer get a free copy of their credit report?
Well, I believe under federal law, you can get a free copy of each of your three credit reports once every
Oh.
12 months. More often, if you are declined for credit, then you can pull that credit report to
But
take a look at it.
but the credit reports will show details of the dates of the payments and whether they were on time or late or this, that, and the other thing.
Absolutely. And also and paying off the balance every month is always the best way. But just to, if you can't, I think it's important to understand how utilization works because people say, well, I'm using a credit card. I may not be able to pay it off every month, but I'm well within my credit limit. Well, there's a thing called utilization, and they look at, as you know, they look at the balance and is it above or below 30% of your credit limit. So if you have a $10,000 credit limit, that means you got to keep that balance under $3,000. Now, if you don't pay it off every month, then just make sure that you make enough of a payment to keep it under $3,000 because that's, the closer you get to the credit limit, the riskier you become to the lender. And that can affect your credit score.
I think that most people don't think about that. And it's one of those well-intentioned things, the next thing you know is you have to use a credit card or you need to do something, and whether their utilization wise are going to be within the right range becomes secondary to what they need it for.
Right.
Nowadays, which I often find frustrating dealing with the powers that be,
Mm-hmm.
is that people very often, in my opinion, use the credit cards. They lose a job, they have medical emergency, and they use their credit cards for
Mm-hmm.
what I think that's the purpose. I needed to use it for the doctor. I don't have insurance. I
Right.
need to pay for food. I'm not getting unemployment. And so people very often can't think in those terms of, uh, should I use it or shouldn't I use it? I think it's more a case of they do what they do.
Mm-hmm.
And then they find out that, suddenly they're filing bankruptcy again. But it keeps us off the street.
Yeah. Well, it's and to say and you'll agree, and I'm sure the listeners understand that it's very easy for the two of us to say, make your payment on time and stay below utilization, but things really do happen that are beyond your control. You can be the most disciplined person in the world, but job loss, sudden car repair that wasn't expected, a medical bill that comes in. Now, that obviously speaks to having an emergency fund, which is part of a good financial plan going forward. And I talk a lot about that on the podcast. But again, it's easy to say, have some money for emergencies when you've
Yeah.
got other bills to pay.
Like my father used to say, if he had wheels, he'd be a baby carriage, you know?
Yes. So yeah, it's easy for us to say, but uh, a lot of times, and not to be critical of people who file bankruptcy, they fall on hard times. But there can be a lot of bad money habits that got them into trouble, and that really need to be identified to keep it from being an ongoing problem post bankruptcy. What would you say are some bad money habits that people have that can prevent them from having financial freedom and keeping their fresh start after bankruptcy?
Well, it's paying attention to what the thing about when you file a bankruptcy and you go sit down with people and you go over their income and expenses and then you go over their assets. It's the first time they've had to quantify anything and look at anything in numbers. And it's not the easiest thing in the world.
Mhm.
I mean, again, example, I'm involved in a case now where a debtor, it's a business bankruptcy. The principal of the debtor was running the business as his own piggy bank.
Mhm.
There was money coming in and money going out. And I've been finally we got across to him. But habits like that are so ingrained. It's like I'm sure a lot of people listening, if you have, you know, it's not really if you're running a business and you're withholding employees' money, nobody's standing there making sure you're paying it to the government. And, in that situation, nobody's looking to see what you're doing with your money. It's
Mhm.
very difficult to rein people in. You know, uh, I don't know if don't ask me. It was the Real Housewives of New Jersey. Don't ask me how I watched this with you guys.
Oh yeah.
And she was on TV paying $120,000 worth of cash to buy furniture,
Huh.
and ultimately heard from the IRS and bankruptcy fraud and all that. It's like nobody thinks. It's like let's spend money. I once, I'll tell from my own perspective, I once went out and bought a sailboat.
Mhm.
What the hell? Came home with it, surprise. A salesman once asked me if I wanted to do it again. I said I learned the first time. But it's very difficult, to rein people in. It's a terrible example, but people who hold, I just represented a client, not in the bankruptcy, but the guy was indicted. He had escrow money that he dipped into for like $15 million. I mean, it's really difficult to stop, it's very difficult. That's all I can
Mhm.
say. It's the temptation is there, and there are people like my wife reminds me all the time because I shop. She says I'm a shopaholic, so I buy things. Uh, but it's if you're that kind of person, it's difficult to rein it in.
I,
Some people, if it has money in if they have money in their wallet, it burns a hole in their wallet.
Mhm. It's what I call depending on retail therapy. People want that dopamine hit, whether it's buying a sailboat or getting the latest iPhone or piece of technology or whatever it is. That whatever the underlying issue is, they feel better by spending money, and it's very difficult to be disciplined about that and say, you'll feel good for a while, but then the credit card bill comes in and you got to pay for it. So having that discipline not to fall into that trap
Very
and just
difficult.
have a better idea of what you spend and keeping track.
Well,
Uh,
like like
we
you
talked.
said early on,
Mhm.
when you prepare the schedules and, 90% of the debtors, they're in the deficit, every month. And how do
Mhm.
you live? I mean, you're not Eastern Airlines or something like that.
Right.
So
Well,
it's
it's a wake up call, and when we look at when you file bankruptcy, you have to account for all of your income, and then you really have to take a hard look. I mean, that's the income part is easy, really kind of the easy part. You just take a look at the pay stubs and do the arithmetic.
right.
You know how much the income is. The difficulty comes in with the expenses because a lot of clients that I've had, I'm sure you've had the same experience, do not have a clear idea of what it costs them to live and are often quite shocked when we push through
Absolutely.
and get hard numbers for the bankruptcy petition, how much they're spending. And it's a good exercise, not only to prepare an accurate bankruptcy petition, but to know what you're spending going forward. And if you're spending in the hole, that fresh start isn't going to last very long, right?
No, listen, I look at it, I find myself saying all the time, it is what it is. You can't, you can try, you can talk to people, like I think when we were chatting before, you can talk to people for an hour and their eyes glaze over and
Mhm.
no clue.
Mhm.
But it's for their benefit. You don't want to become a serial filer. I think that's what the trustee's office calls certain people who file bankruptcies all the time.
Mhm.
You wind up in their sights, so to speak.
Mhm.
You don't necessarily have an easy time of things.
And it's important to bear in mind, as far as serial filing is concerned, if you filed a Chapter 7 and got a discharge, you have to do well because you can't get a Chapter 7 discharge for another 8 years. So, you don't have that option available to you. Now, there's something called a Chapter 13, which involves a repayment plan. But even then, there's an ineligibility period during which, if your goal is to wipe out the debt, that's not going to happen because you're just doing it too often. So you need to be disciplined for a
You know,
while.
I've found that 8 year preclusion against them filing again, the creditors look at that as a good risk. And a lot of
Yes.
my clients tell me that they get credit card solicitations because of that. Because they figure we'll give you a small line of credit, can't file a bankruptcy for 8 years, so we'll give it a shot. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it.
That's what I tell, and that's exactly right. I've told my clients they're amazed. They come to me and said, I got their discharge, and I'm pre-approved for credit cards. And I said, have you looked at the interest rate?
Well, that's
Number one. Number two, just what you say. They know you can't do this again for another 8 years, so you're a much safer
it's a
risk
good,
because they know they're not going to get hammered
you
for
know,
it.
the days of them sending you a solicitation that says sign here and we'll give you $5,000, that you're not going to find. But it's again, looking to restart your credit. That's a good way to do it. You're working in cooperation with some creditor who's taking a risk on you. I mean, and most people listen. You probably find, I happen to think I'm a very entertaining person, but most people don't like to come sit with me and talk about bankruptcies.
Mhm.
They have better things to do on a fall day. Go apple picking or something like that.
Right.
But it's if you play it right, you only have to do it once in a lifetime. You can look
Yes.
at fond memories.
Yeah. Well, I've had some repeat business and it's kind of sad, and usually it's not because they just can't get it together, that things have happened to them again, and they're some of the most financially unlucky people I've ever met, and
We
and
would call them
every
schlamazels.
sympathy. I'm sorry.
Call them schlamazels.
Yes, yes. Someone once told me the difference between a schlemiel and a schlemazel is a schlemiel always spells his coffee, and a schlemazel is who he spills it on. But
I think you got it right.
Uh, so yeah, the things that are beyond your control. But so these bad money habits, the retail therapy, and not um, just keeping track of, not necessarily down to every dollar, every penny, but having a clear idea and a clear budget and some discipline on spending. Any other
I
bad
don't.
habits you've experienced that can interfere with a fresh start after discharge?
I miss that. What?
Any
When
other thoughts? I mean, we talked about a
No,
secured credit card and
I think one they shouldn't look at filing a bankruptcy at the end of the as the end of the world.
mhm,
It's like I said, most people nowadays, there's some reason behind it, not that they went out and spent thousands of dollars and decided they're going to get rid, they took cruises around the world.
right.
And if you work at it and try to rein yourself in, you'll find that you're not going to miss a beat going forward. Very often, the feedback they get mortgages. The only detriment to the financing they may get going forward within a number of years of their bankruptcy is they may not get the best interest rates that some banks offer. If
Right.
a bank has an A mortgage rate, somebody who comes to them within a few years of filing a bankruptcy may get a B or C rate, but at least you're getting back into the game.
Mhm.
And then, you can always go look to refinance it for a better rate or something like that. But you have to really rein in your spending and live within your means. And, very often, that involves, and it's a subject that drives me crazy. I don't know if you encounter it because now these young kids, when they buy a car and they're not satisfied with the car and there's no equity in the car dealers would put them into a new car that has like no equity in it and now has a $50,000 loan because it's a fancier car. And, really, is there a reason to pay $1,200 to get around the street every month? And, stuff like
Yeah.
that, that things like that go a long way to making life easier. I mean,
Mhm.
mishigas when you get down to it, you know.
Exactly. They'll trade in the car, and because cars depreciate so quickly, they're upside down. They owe more than what the vehicle's worth, so they trade it in, and now the loan for the purchase of the new car includes the difference
The diff
on the trade-in, and now they're borrowing even more money than they would ordinarily for that car in the first
Well,
place.
and I've had people, it's the same thing where, I listen, I grew up in an apartment in Brooklyn.
Hmm.
I survived. It's not like a house that I missed and the smells of latkes burning on the stove or something like this. But people have to realize that, you know, in my opinion, a house is a house, and sometimes that's the biggest problem. You're paying $8,000 a month to live someplace, and how much of your income is that $8,000 a month?
Yeah.
You must do a lot of Chapter 13s where they have the mortgage arrears and they throw the arrears in and you add the mortgage arrears plus their current payment. They're paying $12,000 a month to live in a little three-bedroom house. It makes no sense.
Is that how
Yeah.
much houses cost in Boston? My God,
Oh,
four thousand
please.
dollar mortgage payments.
Boston is you don't want to get me, but well, on the other hand, my wife and I sold our house for more money than we thought. So
Oh, okay. All right. So, other than any other thoughts on as far as rebuilding credit, and how long should people realistically expect it to take? Like I said, the bankruptcy sits on their credit for 10 years, but then credit history becomes credit ancient history. You know, if they are proactive in rebuilding, how long do you think it'll take before they
I,
start seeing some positive
I think
results?
it could be almost, instantaneous if you manage to do it the right way. I mean, I know the credit reports we pull for a bankruptcy tell us what their credit score is going to be in a year, and most of them show that they're going to be 100 points higher. And, I found that I don't usually 6 months or a year after some of them, come back and anecdotally they have this or that. They're buying a house, like they need a copy of their petition because they're refinancing their house.
Mm.
So it really, I don't know if, in Jersey it may be more difficult or someplace else, but that's the way it is here in Massachusetts.
Well, it goes to that utilization portion of your
Yeah.
FICO score in that you're going to get an initial bump of maybe 75 to 100 points 6, 8 months down the road because that
Yeah, about
that
that.
by then all of your credit reports have been updated, all of those debts have been marked discharged and zeroed out. So now from the debt load perspective of it, you have very little debt
Right.
and that boosts you up, but you still have the 35% that the uh, payment history represents, and you need to start rebuilding that to get the score even
Absolutely.
higher.
Or
Okay.
rob a bank.
Yeah. So, any other final thoughts? I mean, as far as um,
Nope.
bad habits to get out of and ways to rebuild after bankruptcy?
No, I think you have to, you either there's some people who don't care.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter to them.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to wonder whether that's not a bad way to live. But on the other hand, if you want to, in several years post discharge, buy something, borrow something, improve your credit score, you have to work at it. You just can't be laissez-faire.
Yeah. So it's a
And
proactive thing that you have to do, and it's and not there's reason for hope. Nobody should feel that okay, I got rid of all this debt and now I'm going to have to live with bad credit. You don't, and there are ways to rebuild things and really benefit from that fresh start you're given, and hopefully have a better life.
absolutely.
All right, Barry. Well, thanks for coming on the show. Good to have you and some good insights for people. Uh, Hopefully, it's sort of ironic. Hopefully, a lot of my listeners aren't in, in the midst of bankruptcy or filing, but maybe some of their friends are. It's just some hope that they can have that there are ways
Well,
of rebuilding
it's
afterwards.
I look at it as pre-petition, you're an indentured servant to your creditors. That's basically what it is.
Yeah.
You're a slave.
Mhm.
And post-petition, you're free. I mean, I'm an inveterate cynic, so fresh start, but you do get a fresh start.
Yep.
It's what you do with the fresh start that's
Yes.
important.
Yes. Exactly. What you do going forward. So thanks for being on the show, Barry. I'm sure
Hey,
our listeners got a lot out of it.
this was great. Thank you.
Mhm.